Hello, everyone. Welcome to the New Museum. Hello, hello. We are so glad that you are here today in person. It's a joy to be able to return to shared space. My name is Andrew Westover. I'm the Keith Haring Director of Education and Public Engagement here at the New Museum. I join you today from the unceded land of Lenape people, and I'd like to begin by honoring and paying respect to the Lenape ancestors and people past, present, and future, and their care for our waterways and land. On behalf of the New Museum, I'm glad to welcome you to today's panel entitled On Faith, Matrilineal Art Histories. This program is in conjunction with the exhibition Faith Ringgold, American People, co-curated by Massimiliano Gioni, Edlis Neeson Artistic Director, and Gary Carrion-Muriari, our Krauss family curator. Our panel today will be moderated by Susan Cahan and features panelists Julia Bryan-Wilson, Joan Kee, and Michele Wallace. I'll note that Dr. Wallace will be joining us remotely today due to weather reasons. Programs like this are core to the New Museum's work of advancing new art and new ideas. I would particularly like to thank Education and Public Engagement staff members Andrea Calderes and Derek Wright, as well as the entire New Museum team for their help bringing this program together. New Museum public programs are generously supported by the Bowery Council, and digital initiatives are supported by Hermione and David B. Heller. We also thank our members and supporters, like you, who help make these programs possible. I'll now share brief biographical notes about each of today's panelists. Susan Cahan is an art historian, educator, and curator who specializes in contemporary art and the history of museums. Her research focuses on the relationships between artists, institutions, and social change. Her book, Mounting Frustration, The Art Museum in the Age of Black Power, examines the impact of the civil rights movement on art museums in New York City. In addition to other positions, she previously served as Curator of Education and Deputy Director of the New Museum of Contemporary Art. She is currently the Dean of the Tyler School of Art and Architecture. Cahan received a BA in Art History and English from Tufts University and a PhD in Art History from the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. Joan Kee is an art historian and lawyer who lives in Detroit and works in Ann Arbor, where she is a professor of the history of art at the University of Michigan. A specialist in modern and contemporary art, with particular interests in East Asian material culture from the late 18th century to the present, her forthcoming book, The Geometries of Afro-Asia, explores the world's Black and Asian artists catalyzed through works created from the 1960s to the present. Her other books include Contemporary Korean Art and Models of Integrity. Kee holds a PhD from the Institute of Fine Arts, New York University, a JD from the Harvard Law School, and a BA in the History of Art from Yale University. Michele Wallace is a Black feminist author, cultural critic, and daughter of artist Faith Ringgold. She is the author of several books, including Black Macho and the Myth of the Superwoman, and Invisibility Blues, and is a professor of English at the City College of New York and the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. She holds a PhD in Cinema Studies from New York University, an MA in English from City College, and a BA in English and Creative Writing from City College. Julia Bryan-Wilson is an art historian who lives and works in Oakland, California. She is the Doris and Clarence Malo Professor at University of California, Berkeley, and has authored influential texts that center feminist and queer approaches to artistic labor and textiles. Recent awards and honors include a Guggenheim Fellowship, the Frank Jewett Mather Award from CAA, and the Robert Motherwell Award from the Daedalus Foundation. She holds a PhD in History of Art and a BA in English Literature. And now, logistical notes. This program will last for approximately 1 hour. If there's time, our speakers will answer questions at the Q&A at the end of the program, and I encourage you all to learn more about our upcoming public programs on our website, newmuseum.org. Now I'd like to invite our panelists up to the stage, and I will then turn the conversation over to our moderator, Susan Cahan. Please welcome our panelists.
Thank you, Andrew. And welcome, everyone, to today's exciting panel. I did, actually. Andrew, I not only left my phone, but I left my notes in the ladies' room. Thank you. I'd like to thank the New Museum for this incredible opportunity to reflect on the work of Faith Ringgold and this exciting exhibition, which, as we all know, is long overdue and a historical event. Congratulations to Massimiliano Gianni and his co-curator, whose name escapes me because I forgot my notes in the bathroom. And I'd like to also thank Faith for her faith in us and entrusting us with the interpretation of her work. Thank you, Andrew. I really appreciate that. Great. Gary Carrion Murayari, who collaborated on the exhibition and the catalog, the incredible catalog. So thank you, Faith, for your trust in us. Thank you, Julia Bryan-Wilson, Joan Kee, and Michele Wallace for your participation in today's panel. And I'd like to say just a few introductory remarks to set the stage for us. This is the show that many of us have been waiting for, literally for decades. We are living in a moment now when the omissions in the conventional, shall we say official, histories of art are being called out and addressed. We've seen other moments like this, for example, the early 1970s, and we've also seen sometimes reactionary forces tighten their grip after this kind of elastic expansion. And we need to continue to press to have a fuller picture of art. This exhibition of Faith Ringgold's work goes far beyond addressing her omission or her diminution in the history of art. This exhibition actually subverts and reframes received history of art in its multiplicity of form, content, and materials. Faith's work engages with the history of modernism and also histories of women's traditional cultural expressions and also the intersection of Asian and African traditions and also representations of the urban environment, carceral subjectivity, and so much more. And in this way, Faith's work is a lever that opens up many histories of art and challenges the notion of a single history of art. And so this panel, Matrilineal Art Histories, explores some of the many threads of experience that defy the notion of a single conventional or official art history. So thank you, Faith. And with that, I would like to invite Julia Bryan-Wilson to speak with you.
Well, thank you for that, Susan, and thank you to Andrew and Andrea and everyone at the New Museum, including Massimiliano, for his very kind invitation to me to write for the catalog. I'm going to be speaking very quickly. Both Joan and I are only going to speak for about 5 minutes and then open things up, have Michele respond, and then hopefully have more of a conversation with you. I wanted to address today the idea that Faith Ringgold has been really at the forefront of thinking about children as a political audience. And what you're looking at here are a painting from 1966, where you can see that children are the direct subject or theme of a painting, but Faith is always extremely interested in cultivating and nurturing children as a key audience. And in this, I think she is really very unique. There are not a lot of contemporary artists who understand that children are subjects in their own right, not only to be represented, but also as potential agents, revolutionary agents, as I argue. So here you can see children in front of her mural Die from the Spectrum Gallery, and they're absorbing its lessons. in a way. And she writes really movingly about how she understood from the very beginning of her career, not just as a mother, but also as a teacher, she taught many different levels of education, that children were not just this kind of universal symbol of hope or purity, but that children are, in fact, a stratified category, deeply impacted by the hierarchies of racialization in this country. And I think it's really important to note that the political education that she offered to children went far outside the strictures of the art institution. So, of course, her story quilts and her paintings often were addressed to children and incorporated children as their themes, but she also, of course, has been a majorly influential and award-winning children's book author. And I think that it's really important to me that there is a reading room in this show on the 7th floor with a bunch of her children's books, and that the drawings from Tar Beach, which was her first ever children's book, are presented alongside some of the more fine art representations. Because to me, this is an extremely compelling and signature feature of her art practice, which is its continued address to children directly. This is a really charming doll that was produced in the early 90s of Cassie, the main figure of Tar Beach, that was sold along with a special imprint of the book. And I want to just acknowledge that Faith's conversation with toys and dolls has run throughout her practice. And in fact, some of her moves to soft sculpture came as a direct result of her decision to try to make dolls for children, along with her mother, Willie Posey. So her engagement with children, both as like subject, but also as audience or witness or as a new form of spectator, also has fomented different formal choices. So when she moved in 1979, to make dolls, these are really amazing dolls that she made from an international doll series in collaboration with her mother, Willie Posey. That led her to the soft sculpture that are on display now, that are more absorbed into fine art contexts. And actually, similar dolls like this were first ever displayed here at the New Museum in a show about craft called Labor of Love, curated by Marcia Tucker in 1996. And I think my time is probably running a little short, but I will just finish with this piece that I hope you all do find. It's slightly tucked away. It's in the mezzanine between, I believe, the third and fourth floor. And to me, it's a really powerful evocation precisely of the questions of the child as subject to very specific vulnerabilities, and especially Black children as subject to vulnerabilities. It's a piece that refers to the Atlanta child murders that are still unsolved. A lot remains unknown, where 28 children, Black children, were murdered in Atlanta between 1979 and 1981. And I just want to read a quick quote from theorist Christina Sharp, who notes in her important book, In the Wake, that of course, Black children have not been allowed to be children. And I'll just read this quickly. And she talks about what she calls the deathly adultification of Black children in the aftermath of slavery, noting that, quote, because Black children are not seen as children, and the corral of urban youth holds them outside of the category of the child, they are offered more trauma by the state and state actors, and they are certainly not offered the new world or ways of other imagining that our circumstances demand. And I feel that one of the most important aspects of Faith Ringgold's imagining of children is her address specifically to Black childhood as a space of imagination, as a space to dream, as a space of fantasy. And to me, the importance of the children's books and the toys, et cetera, just really cannot be understated. We cannot overstate the importance of these. And she even describes in her memoir how now there's new generations of curators, art administrators, and artists who had Tar Beach as kids and were allowed to dream as a result of that. And those are the ones who are now including her work in these important shows. So I just want to thank Faith Ringgold publicly for everything that she has done. I think she is an extraordinary artist and an extraordinary activist. and an extraordinary Black feminist who I've learned so much from personally, and I know that this show, I'm delighted that it's been so ecstatically received. Thank you.
Thank you, Julia. I'd now like to ask Joan to speak.
Okay, so I wanted to open with this slide. So this is actually a companion image to some of the archival material you'll encounter on the second floor. So Faith Ringgold being one of the real kind of important figures organizing and seeing the People's Flag Show. So it was a 1970 group show at the Judson Memorial Church. And of course, she was arrested with Jean Toche and John Hendricks for violating flag anti-desecration laws. But one thing that was striking about this image, and one of the things you'll see, so Ringgold is in the center, but you see people from all conceivable backgrounds. And the question of how is it that Ringgold's work is able to assemble all of these different people together, sometimes at great personal cost, is I think a theme that is worth talking about. One, because so all of the individuals that you see here, they are all burning miniature flags on the steps of the New York City Criminal Courthouse, which, by the way, in the 1960s and 70s, operated as sort of one could even call it an alternative MoMA, just because so many artists went in and out of their doors from Tetchingshed to Sol LeWitt. So it's a kind of a nice image to think about how is it that Faith Ringgold is instrumental in foregrounding, say, the law as a means to actualize an artistic self. And one other thing to just think about was the People's Flag Show is that she insisted on a jury trial. Now, as someone who works in criminal defense, this is an incredibly risky thing to do if you are Black and if you are female. Again, you're thinking about, say, a time in which laws are structured and practiced in such a way that I wouldn't call it a suicide mission, but it gives you a sense of the magnitude of risk that Ringgold is willing to take on. Now, moving on to this work, which you'll also see in this exhibition, Church Picnic Story Quilt. This is the centerpiece of a case which in copyright law is something of a classic. So this is a work that was shown in, I don't know if some of you are old enough to remember this. So I grew up in Korea, where you had basically, if you wanted English language broadcasting, you would have to look at the military network, and they broadcasted the show, Rock. So Rock is, that's something I watched religiously. So in this particular episode, so this is called No Notes is Good Notes. And it was a show in which basically this one of the characters is trying to get someone to teach music lessons, and he sort of turns out to be a shyster, and he is basically held to account during this church service. But you'll notice in the background that Church Picnic Story Quilt comes up quite frequently. So these are two images, and then here's another one. Ringgold looks at this and says, well, BET never, so this was commissioned by, this series was commissioned by BET, Black Entertainment Television. And she says, well, they never asked me for my permission. And so she files a lawsuit, and initially it gets thrown out saying that, well, it's just used as background. It's just wallpaper. And Ringgold's is thinking, nah, it comes out for 26 seconds, in a period where a 30-second commercial, even in she files this suit in 1997, 30-second commercial, it costs about $350,000. And she's thinking, my work is on this sitcom for almost that amount of time. Shouldn't I get something? And so she takes it up to the Second Circuit. The Second Circuit is one level below the U.S. Supreme Court. It is also art law central. One day someone should write a book about the Second Circuit and art. It's kind of also
Joan.
And the Second Circuit says, you know what? Faith Ringgold is right. This is not right to have this amount of time devoted to an artwork without, one, permission, and also it infringes upon the market for licensing this work. So Church Picnic Story Quilt was initially licensed, so the artist licensed the reproduction of this quilt as a poster to that the High Museum in Atlanta could use and make money off of. And the court said, well, yeah, this actually infringes upon Ringgold's right to make a living from her work. Now, the reason why this is important is that this now sets a precedent for the uses of music, images on the internet, and this becomes a major precedent. So this is also where we want to talk about how it is that we think about Faith Ringgold not only as an artist, but how does she expand the definition of artist to also include, again, trying to restructure, say, existing laws. And I will also add that this is one of the very few cases in US law where a court actually has to justify how it is that they're looking at visual analysis. And so one of the claims that the Second Circuit makes is that, well, to a lay observer, you can see Black figures in the quilt. And so this goes beyond the idea of art as decoration. Now, that's a very, very difficult thing for a court to admit. Judges love to say, oh, we don't look at visual art, we're not artists. But this gives you just an idea of how it is that we think about Ringgold as an artist that really says, well, yeah, artists should intervene in the ways that laws are structured. Sorry, I'll wrap up in 3 minutes.
It's fascinating.
So one thing that's also quite interesting, and I'm not sure if the curators thought of this, but the quilt is right next to Mother's quilt when you see it, say, upstairs. And it's a good segue to think about how it is that Ringgold's work acts as an important art historical pivot. So the Mother's quilt that she makes in 1983, so this has a strong resonance to Tibetan thangkas. So thangkas are a Buddhist ritual object, could be made on cotton, could be made on silk, usually depicts some kind of deity. Now, the Mother's quilt is made in memorial to Ringgold's own mother, but I also was very curious about the use of textiles, and maybe this is something Professor Wallace can share with us. So the textiles that you see adorning the figure, which is repeated over and over again, like as if it was a Buddhist deity, those are textiles that you would see in Japan, that you would see, again, that takes its cue from woodblock prints. So one of the questions also here that we might think about is Ringgold as an artist that can anticipate a certain kind of global intervention before terms like global contemporary became fashionable. Now, here with this pairing, I bring this pairing together because on the right is a Buddhist thangka from the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam. So she goes to the Rijksmuseum in the summer of 1972, and this is a format that appeals to her. So one, it's portable. You can roll it up. But even more than that, I suspect it has something more to do with the question of format. So the idea that one doesn't own a particular culture, or how is it that we can think about Ringgold as someone who engages in exophonic writing? One of the words I've always been struck by with regard to Ringgold is her use of the word translation. And sometimes it's used quite casually to say, oh, people mingling or using other cultures. But for me, in thinking about translation, one of the interesting dimensions is the idea of writing in a language that is not one's own. And so how can we use that concept to think about Ringgold and push the conversation in terms of culture beyond, say, matters of appropriation? Now, one of the other questions that also the thangkas bring to mind is how does it also loosen what we think of when we, how does it loosen categories like tradition or, say, Asian art? How is it that we might think of a set of rules as more of a guide that shapes improvisation? So here is also one of the details that I've always been kind of mesmerized by. And if you see the thangkas in person, so you go up to the second floor, and you notice that the words they're quite difficult to read, right? but they're painted in gold paint. And one of the questions here is that it has a strong resonance to how text in Buddhist paintings are often written. And they're not meant to be seen in bright lights or fluorescence or anything that we might recognize as quote unquote modern. They're meant to be read in candlelight. And I've always wanted to know, what would it be like to see a Ringgold tanka in candlelight? Would that allow for the kinds of experiences that these tankas bring to mind? Now, the last pairing, and I just also wanted to bring this up, is on the right, you see Sam Gilliam's work. Now, Ringgold's tankas emerged at a time when in New York, and I think Susan, you've written about this, so the death of painting, I know Julia, you've written about this, is a kind of conversation that's been very active. And Sam Gilliam says to Faith Ringgold, well, your works are banners. And so here is also where you get a kind of a sense of sort of the tension between different artists at this time, but also how the supposed death of painting that's been talked about in relation to the early and mid-1970s is really a crisis of description. So it's not so much an admission of a failure of medium category, but a call to recognize how fallible words actually are. So I'll end here for now. I do have other slides I did want to talk to, mainly I did want to talk a little bit about Ringgold and her contribution to the question of a third world paradigm, but I'd really love to hear from Professor Wallace.
Right, and I just want to mention about Sam Gilliam that Ringgold retorted when he said that, oh, but your work is also just like drapery. So she had to come back ready.
The art of the clapback. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Joan, we'll have to come back to that topic because it's fascinating. So thank you so much. And now, without any further ado, hey, Michele, welcome.
Hi, Susan. I'm surprised that you're not going to make some presentations about the demonstrations about which you're so knowledgeable from your book, Mounting Frustrations.
Thank you, Michele. I may, after you speak, and if there's time before we open it up for questions.
Everybody on this panel is so knowledgeable about the activism and the struggles that took place to get us to this time. And as you were presenting, is it Joan Kee? Joan Kee?
Yeah, that's right.
Joan Kee
7
talking
letters.
about the tankas. A couple of stories come to mind to me. And the one I remember hearing is that Sam saying, by the way, my mother has a foundation called the Anyone Can Fly Foundation. And I just want to mention that to the side because Sam Gilliam was one of the artists who's honored by the Anyone Can Fly Foundation. The Anyone Can Fly Foundation is a website online, and you will find a list. When COVID started, we stopped honoring people, but on it you will find an interview with Sam Gilliam and some information about him. I actually interviewed him because I interviewed the people that my mother thought were a little, I don't know. It goes back to the anecdote that I want to tell you about Sam and the thing about the banners, because the way I heard it is they were somewhere together, I thought in DC, maybe at Howard or something. And when I heard about it, Sam Gilliam said that Mother's tankas were banners, and Mother's retort was, have you ever heard of drop cloths? I think maybe she might have said that to Jeff Donaldson, who's Africober, who was then chair of the department. And Sam was known for being, not somebody who you fussed at. Let's just put it that way. And Jeff said, Faith, if you say this drop cloth thing, I'm not going to be responsible for what I just thought it was, it's funny. Of course, Sam's work is, of course, brilliant. And these drop cloths expand to gargantuan sizes. And, he does brilliant things. I think I have a little series of videos and interviews with Sam on my YouTube. I have a YouTube channel. So that's the one thing. Then the other thing about the Tonkas, I love what you're saying about reading the print by candlelight, because one of the things that happened is first the political landscapes. I think you showed one of the Shirley paintings. Those are watercolor paintings with the vertical inscriptions, which are from Black feminists. Some of them I wrote. Some were taken from a collection of writings by Gerda Lerner, Black Women in White America. It was one of the first books that we had in which we could access the documents of African American sheroes like Sojourner Truth, and in the early 70s we were trying to pull ourselves together and find out who the Black women were. One of the things my mother said, she did that before we saw the Tonkas. I was with her when she saw the Tonkas at the Reich Museum, and there was a Tibetan guard that said, don't look at any of this. You need to go down in the basement and see the Tibetan Tonkas. So we went down and saw the Tibetan Tonkas. And that is where the Tibetan Tonka form emerged for Faith, with the help of my grandmother, who sews. And the two of them went, I guess, to the Asian Society or wherever, the Reuben, maybe if the Reuben was still there. And my grandmother was examining the Tonkas and looking at the way they were made, because she would subsequently make a number of the Tonkas, including the ones that framed the slave rape paintings. But to get back to the inscription and the words, I said to Mother, it's hard to read this way, vertical, to read English. And she said, that's why I did it, because she wants to slow people down in terms of reading the quotations from Sojourner Truth. If you speak English and you read in English, you have to take time and really figure out what the words are saying. This is also contributed to by the gold paint. There isn't this notion that everything, the clarity of things should just reach out to you. And as a matter of fact, I think that's kind of a consistent theme in a lot of Faith's work, that you should have to work somewhat to get the message. And so over the years, that gold paint has faded. And it's interesting to hear, actually, that that's part of the Tibetan notion as well of using the Tonka form. I don't know whether, I had the impression that the languages they're writing in are written vertically in that way, but I don't really know for sure about that. But it's very interesting that you pick up on that. Another thing, the mother's quilt. The idea that the mother's quilt is done in a way to address the sacredness of the icon of the Black mother. And there are a number of places. I think Massimiliano has pointed that out in The Flag is Bleeding #2, that there's an iconic substance to the woman who is bleeding with her 2 children in that figure. And I like that because the story of Mother's Quilt is, first of all, my grandmother and my mother did a quilt together called Echoes of Harlem. It was part of a commission called The Artist, a project that somebody thought of called The Artist in the Quilt, that includes all the women artists that we all know now. And what they all did is they all partnered with a quilter. So my mother decided, her mother knows how to quilt, she would partner with Faith. There is a catalog, and it's a wonderful thing to see. That exhibition toured for years. Mother's idea was to collaborate with her mother on making this quilt in 1981, 1980. Meanwhile, previous to this is the collaborations of the Tibetan tankas that went on for about 8 or 9 years. So this is, the tankas form kind of a bridge between painting on canvas and watercolors on paper to doing the quilting. So they did that together. And then Mother's quilt was something that my grandmother had cut. She had cut the pieces and then she died. And so my mother made Mother's quilt. And actually, I never knew, because you don't get to see it that much. I never realized that every piece of Mother's quilt is fabric. So you could say about Mother's quilt that this is the only quilt that's a real quilt, meaning all fabric sewn, that my mother has ever made. And she did that as part of a number of works, which were part of the mourning that she experienced and memorialization of her mother, Madam Willie Posey, my grandmother. So that quilt is very, very special. And Ed Bradley bought that. His wife owns it. I know I'm not supposed to say that, but Ed Bradley is not alive. And he was such a fantastic person. I think he should be mentioned for having the insight. I think he may have bought 2 of her works. And so that was one of that. And then what followed Mother's quilt was the first story quilt, which is Who's Afraid of Aunt Jemima, which was painting and quilting. This too was a quilt that Mother made completely by herself, every single stitch. So it was part of a process. And it reminds me sort of the Tibetan, my notion of the Tibetan meditation over making work. She made that one completely by herself. And that too was a memorial to my grandmother. It's the only quilt other than Mother's quilt. Those 2 are the only 2 that she's ever made completely with no help from anyone. So which makes them very special. Now, rolling backwards to other things that you've mentioned. Well, the flag show. I was there for that. I was involved with those protests. I think of a lot about lately, now that I'm 70, and by the way, I'm also retired. So I'm Professor Emeritus. How much more fun. It was fun. I mean, we were having a great time because we were young, or at least I was young. My mother was pretty young too. She's only 21 years older than I am. So it was, it's wonderful to see people looking at this work and seeing things. Everything that you guys have mentioned is something that basically never occurred to me. That's why it's so important to have this conversation. And right before we went on, some of us were talking about the reviews and some of the things that are being said in the reviews. It's just amazing to have people having this public conversation about her work. Let's see, did I leave anything out of my comments? I don't even know what time it is either.
Michele,
but I did want to
can I ask you a question? Oh, I'm sorry. Go on. I want to ask you a question once you feel you've completed your thoughts.
Okay. I mean, I had initially planned to talk about the American collection, which is very episodic, even more so than the French collection. But ask me a question, because we're in a good place.
Yeah. So you mentioned my own research.
I'm on my porch.
It's a nice porch.
It's Faith's porch. It's Faith's porch.
In Englewood, right?
The weather, in Englewood. The weather is, I know you've been here, Susan.
Yeah, I have.
The weather is a little bit crazy, and I want to, number one, apologize to all of you for not being there. But on the other hand, I want to thank you for allowing me not to be there.
Well, it's
We
wonderful.
We feel you. We really
It's
feel you in the
wonderful
room.
to have you here. It really feels very immediate, actually. We've gotten so used
So
to
much more comfortable.
Zooming. So let me pose you this question, because you mentioned my own research into Faith's activism, and one of the things she did as an activist is she wrote letters to museums, she wrote surveys, she wrote handouts and manifestos to be given out in the museums during protests, and a lot of the history of the protest is captured in the things that she wrote. That because of what she wrote, we now are able to construct a history of protest that we wouldn't have been able to do as fully as possible. So that reminds me that in the tankas where there's text, and in the children's books where there's text, and in the quilts the story quilts where there's text, and even the flag paintings which have embedded or encrypted words, that writing has been such an important part of her practice as an artist that I'd like to ask you to reflect on that, and also to ask the other panelists if you have anything that you'd like to share about that.
Well, I only want to say about all the typing, all the typewritten documents, is that I probably did all that typing.
You're a good typist. Very few typos.
On a selectric. We were selected people. We were selectric activists. I don't know how anybody, my handwriting is unreadable. I don't know, but my mother's handwriting, which is on all the, much of the work, she's always had the most beautiful hand. And, if you ever get a chance for her to sign your book, you'll get to see what that's like.
But as a writer, I mean, I know you're a writer.
I'll tell you the anecdote about the writing.
Yeah.
And that mother likes to tell about Who's Afraid of Aunt Jemima. When she decided that she wanted to do Who's Afraid of Aunt Jemima, she said, Aunt Jemima is our feminist hero. Michele, because she was still thinking of me in 1981 as the writer in the family. Mm-hmm. So she said, I want you to write the story. She's our hero. And I said, no, she's not my hero. I'm never going to get old and fat, number one. Number two, I don't make pancakes. And number three, I run 3 or 4 miles a day trying to, not be Aunt Jemima in any way, sense, or form. I wrote a piece on my blog about Who's Afraid of Aunt Jemima, actually. Actually, it's called The Myth of the Superwoman Revisited, in which I talk about how what she was saying about Aunt Jemima is something that I had to go to graduate school in cinema studies and learn in terms of the history of Aunt Jemima as both a mythic and a real figure. And so by that circular route of education, which, PhDs are circular routes to things, or at least they were to me, by studying it, by finding the history of these images, and there were Aunt Jemima films, she appeared at the Columbian Exposition, and by also just the process of aging, I've come to understand it better. But my mother thanks me now because I wouldn't write that story. She had to write that story. And that unleashed, that helped to unleash the writer in her. She was already writing her memoir, but that's really the beginning of Mother as a writer. And so that was an important step for her, and she just kept writing. And the voice, oh my God, that voice. And my grandmother had died. I thought, my mother, can she write in dialect and stuff? She doesn't talk like that. Huh. So it was kind of like my grandmother died, and Mother appropriated her voice and the voices of all her family members who were dying. They were all around us when I was a child, all of Mother's uncles and aunts and all the sisters and the brothers and the cousins and everything. We grew up around them. And then, in the 60s, everybody slowly died. And my grandmother, until my grandmother would be one of the last ones in 81.
Great. Julia, Joan, do you have anything that you'd like to pose as a question for discussion or respond to my question?
Sure.
Yeah.
I mean, I'll say something a little bit more about Ringgold as a writer. She has a beautiful memoir, which I encourage you to seek out, called We Flew Over the Bridge. But also, I think it's really true that she used her textiles as a form of language, and that quilting in African American traditions has long been a form of communication, alternative communication. I reproduced one of her tankas that had the one featuring Sojourner Truth in my book called Frey, and I speculate that it is actually the beginning of a kind of different art history in which text and textile are intimately interwoven in contemporary art. And of course, text and textile actually come from the same root word in Latin, which is texere, meaning to weave. And with her literal inscriptions of words onto fabric, Ringgold was really ahead of her time in thinking about the conjunctions between the written word and also the tactile experience of putting pieces together in order to tell new stories.
And I bought your book.
Thank you.
Very excited to see that.
Oh, thank you, Dr. Wallace, Professor Emerita.
You know, I know your first book too, about the book about the activism.
Yeah,
Right.
Michelle and I had a very interesting conversation about that before I wrote my
You
book.
and me, Susan?
Yeah.
Because I think I wrote something about it.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway.
Yeah, you did.
This
You
is-
wrote on your blog, and I sent it to all my friends saying, Michele Wallace sort of agrees with me.
Right. This is a
Sort
fantastic
of.
book called
I
Art Workers that Julia wrote in.
For the Art Workers Coalition.
that's
Yeah.
it. Yes.
Yeah.
But
Joan,
I was
did
so
you-
glad you wrote that, because you and Susan, I think, started a wave of people including this in the discussion. If there were no documents from Wasabal or the Museum of Modern Art or any of that in the first iteration of the Dancing at the Louvre exhibition at the New Museum. Right, Susan?
That's absolutely right.
There were no such documents in
Yeah.
the Decade Show. There were
Yeah.
no such, although what is it, Labor
Labor of Love.
Labor of Love.
Labor of Love, I wrote about, for that catalog, I wrote about the Judson Memorial Church arrest.
Yeah, and
But we were a long way from going back to look at our histories in this way.
Yeah.
It
I think that, one of the things that is incredible to me about Faith and makes her a role model for me is just her fearlessness, her boldness, her she did not shy away from confrontation, and her honesty and her authenticity, and at times making herself very vulnerable in that authenticity, like in the 100-pound weight loss quilt, which is like so powerful. But in her activism, she was a force to be reckoned with. And I think that made museums shy away from her. I think that she rubbed the powers that be the wrong way. And I contend that is, and I would support this with evidence that can be actually found in the archives at MoMA. I think that that's what took the Museum of Modern Art such a long time to acquire one of her works, because she long deserved to be in that collection with more than her political prints.
But I think that she did it her way.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the way she's done it has turned out very well for all of us, because she enters not only with the work, but with the history and with a lot of other people. She's always been a bridge figure and a mentor of a lot of people. She always wanted to bring the whole crowd. And that has to do with her fearlessness. She never could understand why it was that art was not supposed to be political. Why it had to be a grapefruit and some cherries. And she just refused to accept that. Then the activism and all the things that she's done for us has come out of this experience of rejection and having the work filling up the storage room in the house. So what she said is, I'm not gonna stay in the house and keep making work. I've got to go out and make a space for the work. And So that was the way the activism functioned, and she made a place for the women.
Yeah. Let me ask you something, and then I think we'll open it up to the audience for questions. And I don't know, Andrew, if we need to have like a microphone or something so that that Michele, that's a slip. Michele can hear the questions.
Everything.
Yeah. Okay, good. I am embarrassed by that slip, so now I forgot what I was going to ask. Oh, I know what it was. So we have had a really tough past couple of years with the pandemic, and a lot of us have really had to find ways of staying optimistic and staying resilient and keeping on doing our work and feeling creative. And I'm just wondering, Michele, can you tell us, if you can tell us how Faith kept her well of inspiration and kept persisting in the face of very real rejection? How did she rejuvenate herself?
Well, I think you will notice that there's a trend in my mother's work, which is toward the positive and the triumphalist. As a matter of fact, that this had to do with some things I wanted to say about the American collection. In particular, We Came to America, because there are so many possible readings of that painting and of her work.
This is the one of the figures floating in the water and the Statue of Liberty. Yeah.
Statue of Liberty. Yeah. When I first saw that painting, I thought they were drowning. Then I found out by talking to her that they're walking on water, and also perhaps flying, which African American slaves had myths and legends of flying back to Africa. But these slaves, they're not going back to Africa. They're coming to the U.S. They're coming to this Black Statue of Liberty. I think that the American collection begins to cobble together an alternative history of African Americans coming here. Because if you think about it, if they burned the slave ship down and walked across the water to be welcomed by a Black Statue of Liberty with a Black baby, that supersedes the whole history of the slave trade. It supersedes slavery itself, the Civil War. I mean, just imagine that's what happened instead of what did happen. You've got no Reconstruction. You don't even really have to deal with what the real history of the building of the Statue of Liberty was in 1880 something, after Reconstruction and while we were experiencing Jim Crow. It's an alternative history of how things might have come. There is a narrative that goes with it, in which actually Marlena, who's the daughter of William and Marie, is having a dream in which this happens. But the painting is without text. And the painting could stand as a correction of the history that we actually had. If, say, all the slave ships trying to come in had exploded in fire from slave rebellions, and there were a lot of slave rebellions, that's the history of the Americas, slavery in America. There were places in the Americas where slavery ended or was circumvented partly by slave rebellions. And so why not us? With our Black Statue of Liberty in the harbor, we walk in, we come on over, and we're greeted differently. And then the next painting is Born in a Cotton Field, which is about an invisible princess. There's a children's book called The Invisible Princess, which is, she's able to be a princess and grow up on a plantation because she's invisible. And I mean, each segment, it's episodic. Also, Marlena's career is parallel to Faith's career. This could have been Faith's life. So, and then the next thing you know, Marlena, who is Faith's contemporary, is having a one-woman retrospective at the Museum of Modern Art with her painting of Josephine Baker dancing. in, I don't know, the main gallery or whatever. She also meditates on the idea in the last of the French collection, which is called Moroccan Holiday. Marlene is having a conversation with her mother, Willa Marie, about the fact that Willa Marie did not raise them, that she sent them back to the United States to be raised by Aunt Melissa. And what they are talking about is, Marlena says that, Aunt Melissa was our hero. And what William Marie is saying is, I'm a hero too. And I'm as much a hero as the four figures. They are Frederick Douglass, Martin Luther King, there's two others.
Malcolm
of
X.
course, Malcolm X, of course. And there's one other, was it Marcus Garvey? Or,
Yeah.
I'm not sure who number 4 is, but in any case, in the story, she's saying, I am a hero. I have accomplished what they have accomplished. I need to be in that galaxy. And you, Marlena, you're too concerned about other things. And I needed to be an artist. So I sent my children, including you, back to the United States to be raised. It's also a fascinating idea, too, to me, that Faith constructed this narrative in the French collection which suggests that to have been an African-American artist in France in the 20s, you would have been much better accepted than you would be in the United States, which is, quite a supposition. And it's based upon the success of Josephine Baker. And I suspect it's not all that likely. Now, where you get that conversation is in Sunflower Quilting Bee et al. All the Black women heroes, Fannie Lou Hamer and Ella Baker, they all gather to do this sunflower quilt for peace in Arles. And they're very concerned about William Marie, because they said, is this a good place for a Black woman to be over here? Because they're keeping in mind the history of slavery, which comes from Europe. Yeah. Whereas William Marie is painting, I think, Van Gogh is in that picture with the vase of flowers. And all the Black women are a little concerned about him and who he is. And so Joanna wants to ask him, what happened to my children? Because, she was Dutch. And just the tension between one of the suppositions of the French collection, which is that the French were more receptive to African Americans at a certain time. But I don't think you would find that would be confirmed by the reception of all the Black artists, William Johnson, Lois Mailou Jones, who went over there and painted. They didn't stay. And if they did stay, they weren't celebrated. But so it's all these alternative histories. Then the thing they discuss, Marlena says, I'm not going to have any children that I'm not going to raise. So what happens to her in the American collection is she doesn't get married and she doesn't have any children. And the last 2 pieces of the American collection are Picnic in the Grass Alone. By this time, Faith has moved to Englewood and is surrounded by trees and loves landscape. And she has a date for a picnic and the guy stands her up. So she's having a picnic by herself. Oh. And then the last piece is Listen to the Trees. And to me, the American collection is a meditation on a woman who goes it alone, who doesn't marry, who doesn't have children. And I've always felt that not only are these figures the shadows of my grandmother and of my mother, but also of me. Because when she wrote the text for the Moroccan Holiday, she sent me the text for my approval. I am just fascinated by fictions. It really is an extraordinary thing that people do, because they're telling you true stories, but they're putting it in forms in which you're able to absorb it without the shock
Mm,
of the truth.
thank you so
And
much. Yeah.
I can see that in, every level. I've begun another interpretation of the work along these lines. And the idea is that in the end, faith always gives you a winning scenario, despite, like in Die, the very gritty, or The Flag is Bleeding, the very gritty, very sad things that she does work about.
Thank you, Michele. That's such a fascinating concept to think of the quilts as fiction, as stories to experience metaphorically and inspirationally.
They're political fiction.
Yeah.
Which is my favorite kind.
So with that, I would like to open it up to the audience for a few questions. And Joan tantalized us with a tidbit, if anybody's interested in probing that further, about how the Tonkas push the conversation about hybridization beyond cultural appropriation. So if anybody's interested in hearing her talk about that, that would be great, or any other questions.
Yeah, the thing that attracted me to this talk was the word matrilineal, which I find very interesting in so many ways. And if it's not too personal, what is and maybe was your relationship like with your mother and your grandmother?
You're speaking to Michele, yes?
Michele, the other three will have to speak for themselves. But because mother has adopted so many women, my relationship with my grandmother was fantastic. She was very loving and very supportive. I think she was easier on me than she was on her own children. But she died in 1981. 1981, mother was 51, and I was 29. So we lost her. And I've often thought about women, that it's very important what age you are when you lose your mother, I think, because mother was able to rally and make a great deal of work out of that loss. My grandmother passed the baton to her. I had a great relationship with my grandmother. My relationship with my mother has been somewhat more tempestuous and what would you call it? Uneven. But I've spent the last, I'm not sure, 20, time goes by so fast when you're not having problems. All I can say, I don't know how long it's been. I think it's been 30 years that we've been nearly inseparable. And now we are very close. We don't argue about the things that we used to argue about. And, I'm a total and committed fan. But I still wonder why. I still ask myself, with all the writing I did about faith before I wrote Black Macho, and all the writing I did about faith after I did Black Macho. And I would point out as well, my last collection, which was Dark Designs and Visual Culture, which there's a lot of pieces about faith. What happened with Black Macho that it didn't get in there? And I do think that in the early feminist movement, which was in the 70s, second wave, there was this bifurcation between the art and the politics. And there were lots of feminist artists who were feminists. None of them were Black, pretty much. And the people who shepherded my book to publication were not feminists. And then Ms. Magazine did a cover and an excerpt, and they were feminists, but they weren't interested in Black women artists. And I was 27, and I wanted my book to come out. And so, it's just this extraordinary hole in my relationship with faith. So, which is why I've been working on this book called The Myth of, and what I didn't get is the thing about the Superwoman. I couldn't swallow that at 27, not at 29. I couldn't swallow any more than I could swallow Aunt Jemima.
Michele,
And
can I refer people to the A Letter to My Daughter? Is that okay with you?
Yes, it is.
Okay,
Yes.
so I would like to recommend this really incredible
It's a wonderful
book
critique.
called A Letter to My Daughter, Michele Wallace, in response to her book Black Macho and the Myth of the Superwoman, in which
Faith Ringgold.
do you want to describe it, Michele?
Well, it was a series of letters that my mother wrote to me in book form. It was to be included in the memoir, but the first thing they did was take it out. So then it was a 100-page document, which Faith tried to get published in a number of different places. And finally, she decided, my sister typed it up and illustrated it, and she decided to publish it herself on Kindle. So one can get a copy of it. I learned a great deal from reading it.
Well, what it is, let me just tell people if they're not familiar with it, it is a critique of Michele's book. And she takes Michele to task for what Faith believes to be her misunderstanding of certain ideas, her interpretation of certain political relationships. And then she has some praise as well. But it's a very honest, it's an honest dialogue, because she's dialoguing with passages from the book, and one rarely sees that kind of thing in public. Yeah.
Nobody else did that, by the way.
Mm-hmm.
So when I was finally able to take it in and to read it, it is invaluable, because in addition to it being a heartfelt response to my book, she also told me a lot of things about her own history and experience of the civil rights movement that I had no idea about. Like inviting Fannie Lou Hamer to collect money at my grandmother's fashion show.
Right.
I think my mother assumed that I was taking stuff in, but I was just a kid, and I wasn't. I didn't know. I don't really remember that. I don't know that I was a kid at some point. I was a kid longer than most, but I've come to really love that book. Whenever I want to, it's like it's a supplement to the memoir.
Yeah, and
because there's a bit more detail about her own activism and her attempt to be involved in the civil rights movement.
And in the book, I actually have the page in front of me now. Faith is taking Michele to task for not remembering having met Fannie Lou Hamer, and she says, "Had you missed it?" She was going from table to table collecting money. This is Fannie Lou Hamer. Had you missed it, or did you think Fannie Lou Hamer was one of Mother's larger-sized models wearing a new look? She is.
Which might have been, because my grandmother always had one fat model. She was way ahead of everybody. Now everybody has to have one. My grandmother always had one.
All right. Do we have more questions from the audience? Julia, Joan, anything more you'd like to add?
I thought that last comment from you, Professor Wallace, was just note perfect. And that's something that Julia brought up, and I think maybe should that be our final note?
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you all
you.
so much. Thank you.